NATO leaders are in Madrid for a summit aimed to set the goals of the military alliance for future. Now, top on the agenda is boosting defenses against Russia and supporting Ukraine. NATO Secretary General has spoken of a comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine. He's encouraging member states to boost their military spending as well. Finland and Sweden's membership bids are also on the agenda of the three-day summit. Welcome to the Spotlight. I'm your host, Behruz Najafi, and these are our guests in this episode of the program. We'll have Senior Research Fellow with Global Policy Institute, George Szamuely, who's joining us out of Budapest. Also with us will be Independent International Affairs Analyst Gilbert, Doctorow. He is in Brussels. Good to see you, gentlemen. Welcome to the show. Now over to Budapest to George. George, as you know, NATO leaders say that they are going to sign off, as they put it in their own words, on major decisions like a new strategic concept, boosting deterrence and defense, and also greater support for Ukraine. So what do you expect would come out of the summit?
Well, I imagine they will announce this new strategic concept. We already know the basic outlines of it. They're going to put in a lot of pre-positioned equipment in Eastern Europe. They're going to boost the NATO readiness force. Currently 40,000, they're going to boost it to around 300,000. And they're going to assign different countries to have special relationships with certain other countries in Eastern Europe so that they would be able to transfer their forces rapidly to Eastern Europe. So, for instance, German forces would be rapidly moved into Lithuania. So I think that will be the outlines of the new strategic concept. And of course, it will name Russia as a threat to NATO. The problem is, of course, is that NATO, by its very existence and by its project of unlimited expansion, is creating its own threats. The more it continues to expand, the more it insists that nothing must stop its expansion, the more it's creating problems, because the more it's creating alarms among other countries in the world. So now they're planning on moving into Asia, which they have to know China is going to look very much askance at it. So yes, they're labeling Russia as a threat, but this is a threat that NATO has created for itself.
Now, Gilbert, NATO Chief Stoltenberg claims it's in everybody's interest to support Ukraine, because if Russia wins, then the world will be more insecure. Do you agree?
As your previous panelist was suggesting, the threat to security is generated by NATO itself. The war in Ukraine is a war that was foisted upon Russia. It was not in their interest or their plans to be fighting this war. But now that they're engaged in it, they are de facto fighting all of NATO. So the meeting in Madrid is going to be posturing. Is going to be appearing before the press and getting the microphone and trying to look very tough and decisive in front of the home voters. But this is posturing. This is not reality. Reality is what's going on in the battlefield in Ukraine. And in this area, Russia is not only fighting against all of the Soviet equipment that had been stored within Eastern Europe by the former Warsaw Pact countries, but it's fighting against the latest equipment that NATO has in only limited supplies for itself. Moreover, it is also fighting against manpower from NATO. It has come out in the last 2 days that there are military and tactical advisors, special forces from Poland, from the United States, actively participate in. To say that it's not is a very legalistic and Jesuitical discussion. The fact is that NATO is presently at war with Russia.
Okay. Now, George, Would NATO leaders grant membership to Ukraine as a new member of the military alliance, or will they suffice to the countries joining the European Union?
Well, I think that in effect, Ukraine is a de facto of NATO. I mean, NATO, everything but at Russia. So Ukraine, is a matter of member of NATO, in which it NATO. I mean, it's like if you look at Article 5, in which it states all members will do whatever they can in the event that one of them is attacked. Well, that's exactly what the NATO member states have done. So everybody has contributed to helping Ukraine. So in effect, Ukraine is a de facto member of NATO. The problem for NATO there is that having essentially thrown their lot in for Ukraine, they don't really have a backup plan, because if things escalate, for instance, with Lithuania, which has imposed a kind of a partial blockade of Kaliningrad, and NATO is blustering that, well, if Russia tries to break the blockade, violates the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Lithuania, then Article 5 goes into effect. Well, Article 5 is already going into effect. What more will NATO do on behalf of Lithuania that it hasn't already done on behalf of Ukraine? It's going to launch missiles on Russian territory? I don't think so. So it's the problem that kind of NATO has shot its bolt. It doesn't really have a second act.
Okay. Now, Gilbert, NATO is also expected to discuss deploying more troops to Eastern Europe. And as you know, Moscow has said that one of the main reasons for the war in Ukraine is NATO's encroachment on its borders. So what should we anticipate if there are more troops near Russian borders?
Well, the question is whose troops and which governments are controlling those troops. The question of Ukraine is a special case. It has a rabid leadership. It has neo-Nazis in the entourage of the president who are controlling the foreign policy and the military policy of the country. Ukraine is a viciously anti-Russian country intent on military destruction of Russia. It was intent, as was clear from the appearance of Zelensky at the Munich Security Conference earlier this year, it was intent on receiving or developing its own nuclear force with only one objective, to use it or to threaten to use it against Russia. So Ukraine is this wild card. It's the loose cannon on the deck. The other countries in NATO, even the Baltics, have a little bit of common sense, and they have a little bit of restraint and a bit of fear of God and of Russian military power. In that sense, having a large contingent of rapid deployment forces in Eastern Europe does not by itself threaten Russia the same way as a smaller force of 200,000 in Ukraine was an existential threat. It was a state out of control and acting in an irrational and self-destructive way. For that reason, Ukraine had to be stopped. The deployment on a rotational basis, or even with the basic troops in the background, not in the forefront, not on the front line states, whether it's 300,000 or 400,000 or whatever, is not intrinsically an existential threat to Russia.
Okay. Now, Georgia, NATO is expanding its presence in Eastern Europe and its member states, especially the U.S. is flooding Ukraine, with billions of dollars in weapons. Is the U.S. risking a military confrontation with Russia?
Well, it's always a risk because this is serious business for Russia. This is existential. I mean, this is not a war that they're going to lose. It just simply is inconceivable for Russia to lose this war, because then the Russians regard this as the end of their state, their historic state. So this is not a war that they will lose. Therefore, the more the United States, the more NATO gets itself involved, directly and indirectly, and they're clearly involved far more extensively than just simply sending in a lot of heavy military equipment. They're involved in targeting. They're involved in destroying Russian, Russian military equipment, even targeting maybe Russians on the Russian side of the border. So this is serious stuff, and therefore there is going to be a point at which Russians will get very tired of it. Now, it may well be that Ukraine is already on its last legs. I mean, there are already indications that the level of casualties that Ukraine is sustaining at the moment is something that just cannot go on, and that within the next few weeks, next month, Ukraine military will just simply collapse. In which case, that's the war, at least this phase of the war, will come to an end. But if it doesn't come to an end, then absolutely, there's a real danger that Russia will come into direct military conflict with NATO member states.
Okay. Now, Gilbert, Sweden and Finland have applied for NATO membership, which requires the consent of all member states, as you know. But Turkey is opposed to this. So your thoughts on that and reasons for Ankara's opposition?
Well, Ankara stated its opposition very clearly. It relates to the very warm welcome that Sweden in particular, and Finland to a lesser extent, have extended to Kurdish refugees, many of whom had been fighting the Turkish government before they left their country and sought refugee status. This is a basic demand of Turkey that the Swedes extradite a certain number of individuals who are identified by the Turks as being terrorists. It is improbable that the Swedish government will agree to that because of domestic opposition. Therefore, they are at loggerheads. And in the immediate future, it is very doubtful that Turkey will give its assent to these memberships. So we may expect that this summit will end without any progress on that issue, notwithstanding the fact that for sake of diplomacy and appearances, the parties will meet face-to-face during the summit. That is to say, Turkey, Finland, Sweden, and Stoltenberg as the director of NATO. Right. No, don't expect any progress on that. I think that Turkey has a legitimate reason, and that is recognized even by Stoltenberg. But more to it, Turkey is exerting its weight. Okay. It has been humiliated by its 22-year candidacy for the EU, and it is taking its revenge by showing its power by being the one hand that goes up, the one hand that has the courage to oppose the 26 other members. And it's going to exercise that right and to demonstrate its key importance in the alliance.
Now, Georgia, NATO is going to boost its rapid reaction force to 300,000, and that's 8 times the size of the current force. And this being part of what the alliance itself is calling an era of strategic competition. The question is how costly this strategic competition will be and who's going to foot the bill?
Well, that's a very good question. Because these are very big numbers that we're talking about. And Germany itself has already committed to laying out an extra $1 billion, or maybe more than that, what I think, I can't remember, it's 100 billion or whatever, on its military. This is a lot of money, particularly as already we've got serious problems with inflation and serious problems with food shortages and the energy. I mean, the EU, as things stand, is committed to cutting off all oil imports by the end of the year. So it's hard to see how Europe can possibly afford any of this. I think it's a highly risky strategy. I think it's for the Russians. They really, for them, they've basically said the problem is when they have NATO infrastructure on their borders. And I think that's really the issue. I mean, it's that they cannot have that. It's, you know, you can have all sorts of troops, under NATO command and whatever. But if you start building infrastructure right on its borders, then I think that's a problem. And I think that's the Baltic states. If they start building military infrastructure in the Baltic states, they start building military structure in Finland, if Finland does indeed accede to NATO, I think that will be a problem. And I think that could well be the next round of military confrontation between NATO and Russia.
Okay, and their summit to Gilbert and NATO is going to discuss their new strategy concept in a decade, and that will mention China as a concern for the first time. Of course, member states are not sure how to describe China, that is in position the largest military in the world and it has good relations with Russia. Your take on that?
Well, the view to China and the expansion to the east of NATO all the way to China is a kind of metastasis of the cancer that NATO is. I don't think that the Chinese are very alarmed at NATO mentioning them for the first time ever, as in their doctrinal statement, as a challenge, as particularly as an ideological and values challenge to the EU. That I think they understand that is this statement, inclusion in the NATO doctrine, is a kind of Hail Mary, a kind of statement of solidarity with the United States, since the United States is pushing the issue of China as a danger to world security. China is a danger only to U.S. global hegemony. It certainly is not a security danger to Europe in any way. So it's an exaggerated threat that is accepted by European leaders only as they have accepted every harebrained new thought coming out of Washington regarding sanctions and punishing Russia. What we have seen in the G7 summit that has just ended is the kneeling of the European leaders before the United States president, and none in a more slavish way than Emmanuel Macron, who was caught by cameras running up to Biden, interrupting his conversation, private conversation, in a stroll with Jake Sullivan, and telling him, as we heard clearly from the microphones, that France is doing its utmost, Europe is doing its utmost, but they cannot live without European oil. Well, there you have it. This is a bunch of knaves, a bunch of servants of the United States, which is itself in a political strife and is led by a senile president. This is a very striking situation, unique, I would say, and it doesn't hold the prospect of a strong NATO or of a strong Europe. On the contrary.
George, given what's happening and NATO's plan to further expand and give itself a shot in the arm, so what kind of a prospect do you depict for global peace and security?
Well, I think they're quite bleak. I think, again, NATO has undertaken this project. It's like it's obviously not able to survive other than through expansion. And of course, when you do expand, you come into confrontations with other powers. I mean, we've already seen how it came into confrontation with Russia. There was never any need to do so. Russia gave so many warnings over the years about their concerns over NATO expansion. Throughout last year, they were giving warnings. In December, they issued those, those two documents as proposals for a modus vivendi between NATO and Russia. NATO ignored all this and continued. So now they're doing this in Asia. Well, China is not going to tolerate the creation of some kind of a NATO in Asia. the purpose of which is essentially containment of China. So in other words, to surround China with enemy states, much as NATO has tried to surround Russia with enemy states. So by doing so, they are provoking a confrontation. I mean, other great powers are just not going to tolerate being surrounded by hostile states. We know this from history, that sooner or later they're going to react, and the consequence is war.
Now, Gilbert, what about long-standing internal challenges within NATO? Like, if you remember, some countries like France were pushing for a European NATO. Is that on the back burner as it is, as NATO is preoccupied with the war in Ukraine?
No, I think things have moved on. What we have now is the EU becoming NATO. The two have become almost identical. And this, the possible admission of Finland and Sweden would take the numbers of EU member states up to something like 23 out of the 12. That is, almost all of the EU member states would then be NATO members. We have to remember that the EU, though it's widely known as a trading bloc, as an economic unit, as a political force for peace, in fact, it has a very big defense dimension all by itself. And that, going back to 2014, was one of the sticking points why the Russians objected so strongly to the EU running away with Ukraine. Because in one of the secret protocols attached to the cooperation agreement that was given to Yanukovych was, of course, the statement that Ukraine would align its foreign policy and its defense policy with the EU. So I'd like to take a step back to the question that you just raised about the prospects for peace.
30 seconds, please.
Oh, I don't believe that we are in a serious situation. The United States backed away from North Korea, which had 1 or 2 nuclear weapons. Russia has as many.
Unfortunately, we have a bad connection there. And also that's the end of our show. So let me thank our guests. We had Senior Research Fellow with Global Policy Institute, George Szamuely in Budapest, and Independent International Affairs Analyst, Gilbert Doctorow from Brussels. And thank you for watching this episode of The Spotlight. I've been your host, Behruz Najaf, and I'll see you next time.